Wyoming Territory, 1878. The wind hit hard out by the foothills of the Bighorns, and the train didn't stop long in Buffalo. Just long enough for Virginia Lark to step off with a broken suitcase and a heart still pounding from what she had left behind. She had not cried on the train. Not when the heavy doors of the diner slammed behind her. Not when she saw the blood on her apron and realized she could never go back. But now, standing in the chilly dusk with nothing but a cracked pair of boots and a few bills tucked in her coat, her breath shook like it might fall apart. She had no plan, no people. Only a name someone whispered in a back alley 2 nights before: "Try the homesteads north of Clear Creek. Folks out there do not ask questions." The sky dimmed into that aching blue before sunset. Virginia pulled her coat tight and started walking. It was near midnight when her legs gave out on the edge of a narrow dirt road. The moon was pale above, and the cold started to bite through her sleeves. She was sitting in the dirt, holding her knees, when the sound of hooves came slow and steady from the dark. A lantern swung on a saddle. A man rode up, then stopped. He had a quiet way about him, like someone who had not spoken to folks in a while. His horse shifted, and he stared down at her without saying a word. Virginia forced herself to stand. "I am not trouble," she said, voice hoarse. The man dismounted. He was tall and broad, with a thick coat and a worn hat pulled low, dark hair curling at the ends. His eyes searched her face, serious, tired eyes, but kind. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just lost." He looked at her shoes, then at the torn suitcase clutched in her hand. "You hungry?" She nodded. "Come on," he said, and led her to his horse. She hesitated for a second, then climbed up behind him. They rode in silence. The cold was sharper out in the open, and she pressed her hands against her stomach to keep them warm. The man's back was solid. His coat smelled like wood smoke and dry hay. The cabin came into view after a wide bend in the tree's small but clean, lantern light visible through the cracks in the shutters. A barn sat nearby, and smoke rose from the chimney. He helped her down. "I am York Callahan," he said. "Virginia Lark." He nodded once, then opened the door and let her step inside first. The heat hit her sharp. It smelled of stew and wood and something sweet. She blinked back sudden tears, overwhelmed, but said nothing. York moved slow and steady, setting another log on the fire, ladling food into a bowl, pouring water into a cup. He handed both to her without a word and sat across the room to give her space. She ate like someone who had not in days. When she finished, he handed her a folded quilt. "You can sleep in my bed," he said. "I will take the floor." You need it more." She stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" York tilted his head slightly. "You look like someone who needs rest, not questions." She swallowed hard and nodded. That night, Virginia lay in a clean bed for the first time in weeks. She stared at the low ceiling, listening to the quiet crackle of firewood. York slept on the floor by the hearth, his breathing calm and even. She did not know what tomorrow would look like, but for tonight she felt safe. The morning came pale and cold. Virginia woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on wood. York stood by the stove, sleeves rolled up, cooking without turning around. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "I did, thank you." He nodded and set a plate down in front of her. Eggs, biscuits. Salt pork. She had not known a man to cook like that. "I can help," she said after breakfast. "I owe you that much." York looked over at her. "Do you know how to milk a cow?" "No," he cracked the faintest smile. "Then I will teach you." That day she followed him through chores. He showed her how to gather eggs, how to sweep the barn, how to carry water from the stream without dropping the bucket. He did not treat her like she was fragile, but he never pushed her too hard either. In the afternoon, he handed her a pair of old boots from a shelf. "These might fit." She put them on. They did. Days passed like that. Chores, meals, quiet. York did not ask where she came from. He did not push. He simply let her be. But one afternoon, as snow flurried in soft circles outside, Virginia stood by the stove while York chopped wood just outside the door. She watched him through the window, his strong back, his steady rhythm, the way he paused to look up at the sky like he was listening to something only he could hear. and she felt something she had not in a long time, warmth. It scared her. That night they sat at the table, hands wrapped around mugs. York glanced at her across the rim of his cup. "You are not just passing through," he said. She met his eyes. "No, you running from something." Her hands tightened around the mug. "Yes." He nodded once, like he had expected that. "I will not ask what unless you want to tell me." She took a breath. "There was a man at the diner where I worked. He followed me after closing. I fought him off. There was blood. I ran." York's jaw tensed. She watched his knuckles go white around the cup. "Did he hurt you?" "No." "But if I had not run?" He stood and walked to the fire, staring into it for a long time. Then he spoke, voice low. "You can stay here, Virginia, as long as you need. No one will find you here." She stood too, heart pounding. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He turned slowly. "Because sometimes people deserve a place to start over." She looked at him, really looked. This man who lived quiet, worked hard, who asked for nothing and gave everything, and something inside her shifted. She stepped closer. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. His eyes softened. "You do not need to thank me." But she did, and she reached for his hand. He let her. And for the first time she felt like she might find something good again, maybe even something better than good, maybe even love. The thaw came late that year. Snow clung to the north slopes even as April crept in, and the ground turned to thick, sucking mud that made every step a negotiation. Virginia had taken to wearing York's second coat when she worked outside. The sleeves rolled once at the wrist. It carried the scent of pine and iron tools, and though she didn't say it aloud, it steadied her. York was mending the chicken coop when she found him. She held a pail of cracked corn in one hand, her fingers raw from the cold. "You always fix what isn't broken?" she asked, stepping over a half-buried root. "The wire's loose on the west side," he replied, not looking up. "Something's been sniffing around at night." "I'd rather not lose a hen to carelessness." Her eyes flicked to the hammer resting on the split stump beside him. "You think it's a coyote? Maybe. Could be something hungry." She set the pail down and crouched beside him, watching as he twisted wire around the frame with practiced hands. "You always this careful?" He paused, then looked at her. "Lost a lot in the war. Learned it's easier to keep something if you pay attention before it's gone." She didn't speak for a while. The wind carried the scent of damp soil and thawed bark. She reached for the wire cutters and he handed them over without hesitation. "You served?" she asked, voice low. "With the Union, Missouri Infantry, 4 years. She didn't ask for stories. The way he said it told her enough. "My older brother died in uniform," she said after a moment. "Never made it past Petersburg." York gave a single nod. "I'm sorry." They finished the repair in silence. When it was done, he stood and offered his hand to help her up. Her palm met his, rough against rough, and neither let go for a few breaths longer than necessary. That evening they didn't speak much. She grated turnips at the table while he oiled the hinges on the front door. The stove hissed quietly behind them. Outside, sleet fell in thin ribbons against the windows. When she set the knife down, she turned to him. "I need to earn my keep," she said. His hands stilled on the oilcloth. "You already do. Not just chores, something more." She pulled a folded scrap of paper from her skirt pocket. "I can read and write. I kept books at the cafe. If you know anyone needs letters written or read, I can do that." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll ask around on supply day. Someone always needs help with that sort of thing." Her shoulders eased. "Thank you." The next morning, while York loaded the wagon for the trip into town, she found a small ledger book on the shelf behind the stove. Its cover was worn, the corners thumbed soft. Inside were neat columns of figures, handwritten with care. The last entry had been almost a year ago. "You stopped keeping track," she said as he stepped back inside for his gloves. He glanced at the book in her hands. "Didn't see the point." "Well," she said, setting it on the table, "now you have someone who does." He didn't answer right away. Then he reached over and tapped the pencil beside the ledger. "Then it's yours." That afternoon, he returned with flour, nails, and a folded note from a widow north of the ridge. She needed a letter written to her brother in Kansas City. Virginia boiled water for tea, sat down with the candle lit low, and wrote by firelight. York watched her from the armchair, his eyes unreadable but steady. "You look like you belong here," he said when she finished. She set the pen down, blinking at the compliment. "Maybe I do." Neither of them moved for a long moment. The wind outside had calmed. The fire hissed low, steady. "Do you want to?" he asked, voice rougher than before. She turned toward him. "What makes you ask that?" "Because I do," he said simply. "Want you here?" She stood and walked to where he sat. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, slow and deliberate. "Then I will stay," she said. He looked up at her, something soft and certain in his expression. "You sure?" "I am." And with that, the last of the unease between them slipped away. She stayed. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. By mid-May, the earth had softened enough that York began clearing ground for potatoes behind the barn. Virginia joined him each morning, tying her hair back with a strip of muslin and rolling her sleeves past the elbow. The sun lay warmer on their shoulders each day, and the scent of damp soil clung to their skin long after the work was done. York kept a rhythm in his movements, measured, deliberate, efficient. He didn't speak much during the work, but his presence had grown easier, less guarded. Virginia had started to understand the weight behind his silences, not empty but full of thought. She never filled them with unnecessary words. One morning, after breaking up a patch of stubborn sod, she leaned on her shovel and squinted toward the ridge. "Do you ever go hunting?" York paused, wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Sometimes, mostly in fall, elk if I'm lucky. Mule deer usually." "I've never fired a rifle," she said, "never even held one." He looked at her a moment, then set his hoe against the fence. "You want to learn?" She hesitated. "Would you teach me?" He nodded once. "After supper." That evening they walked out to the edge of the pasture where the land dipped slightly toward a dry ravine. York handed her his Winchester, then stepped back, folding his arms. "It'll kick. Not bad, but don't lean into it. Keep your feet set." Virginia steadied the rifle against her shoulder, heart quickening. The weight surprised her, solid, real, nothing like the polished silver cutlery she'd once wrapped in napkins back at the cafe. "Pick something to aim at," York said. She picked a low stump near the tree line, then hesitated. "What if I miss?" "Then you do. You'll learn." She pulled the trigger. The crack rang sharp across the field, and her shoulder jolted back. The shot went wide. York stepped closer, adjusted her elbow slightly. "Try again." The second shot came truer, not a bullseye, but enough to split bark from wood. She lowered the rifle, smiling despite herself. "That felt honest." York's lips twitched, almost but not quite a smile. "That's one way to describe it." They stood there a moment longer, dusk curling around the edges of the hills. When they walked back, Virginia carried the rifle herself. The next week brought news from town. A teacher's wife had fallen ill south of the creek, and Virginia volunteered to carry broth and linens. She packed a basket and rode out on York's mare, promising to be back before sundown. When she returned, her cheeks were windburned and her hands stained with iodine. York met her in the yard, his face unreadable. "Everything all right?" he asked. "She'll live," Virginia said, sliding off the saddle. "But not easily." He took the reins from her. "You didn't have to do that. I know." They didn't speak again until the dishes were done. Then, sitting across from each other at the table, York leaned forward slightly. "You miss the city," she shook her head. "I miss my sister. I miss hot baths, but I don't miss noise without reason." York's gaze held her. "If you ever wanted more than this, you should have it." "I never had this before," she said, "so I don't know what more would even look like." A long pause settled between them, filled with the creak of the stove and the soft ticking of the wall clock. "I want you here," York said, voice low. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Then I'll stay." He turned his hand under hers, lacing their fingers together. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, soft as breath. Inside, the space between them finally closed, quietly, without ceremony. They stood together, and he led her to the hearth. The fire cast flickering light across the floorboards, and when he kissed her, it was steady and sure like the rest of him. She rested her head to his chest, listening to the sound of a heart that had waited a long time. No one spoke. There was no need. The truth of it sat between them, earned, not assumed. Later, lying beside him beneath the old quilt, Virginia watched the shadows on the ceiling and felt the weight in her chest ease for the first time in years. She was not passing through anymore. She was home. By early June, the cabin's garden rows had started to green, and the creek behind the pasture ran high and fast with meltwater. Virginia stood barefoot on the cool porch boards, wringing the last of the morning's wash into the basin. Her dress clung damp at the sleeves, and her cheeks were flushed from scrubbing. York was out near the south trail mending a stretch of fence flattened by a windstorm 2 nights past. She hung the last shirt on the line, then stepped inside to pour hot water over dried mint leaves. The scent rose clean and sharp, reminding her of the small potted plant York had brought her from the edge of the hills last week. He hadn't said anything when he set it on the windowsill, just touched the rim of his hat and returned to the barn. She hadn't asked where he found it. When he returned that afternoon, his shirt was streaked with dust and his hands were scraped. He set his tool roll by the door and leaned down to unlatch his boots. "You get it all upright?" she asked, handing him a damp cloth. "Close enough. I'll brace it better once the ground dries some." She took his hat and brushed the dirt away without being asked. "You always do the job twice, if it means it holds." They lingered near the doorway, the late sun cutting a wide bar of light across the floor. She could hear a meadowlark out past the wheatgrass, its song thin and restless. "I've been thinking," she said, resting her hand lightly on the back of a chair, "about teaching some of the younger ones to read." The widow on the ridge said her boy's near 13 and still can't write his name. York nodded once, slow. "You'd be good at that." "I'd need a proper slate, maybe some primers if there's any left in town. I'll ask at the mercantile next trip." She looked up at him. "You always say yes. Only when I mean it." That night, she sat on the floor with her back to the hearth, sorting through the scraps of cloth she'd been saving from worn shirts and flour sacks. York sat at the table, his knife moving carefully over the handle of a broken rake he was shaping into a new hoe. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" she asked, not looking up. He paused. "Not like this. How'd you come to the land?" "My uncle died in '74, left me the deed. I came out that spring and never left." She reached for a square of red calico. "You ever think about leaving, trying for somewhere else?" "No, this place grew quiet in my bones. I stopped looking past it." She let the cloth rest in her lap. "I think I was always looking past things, past towns. Past men who didn't mean what they said. Past the next shift." York set down the blade. "You're not looking past now." She met his eyes. "I'm not." He stood then, crossed the room, and knelt beside her. His hands, rough from fence wire and tools, rested gently over hers. "I don't want this to be borrowed time, Virginia. It isn't. I want to build something that lasts, with you." She looked down at their joined hands, then back at him. "Then we will." The wind outside had slowed, and the cabin was warm with the promise of evening. When he leaned in, his lips brushed hers like he was asking a question. She answered with the way her fingers curled around the back of his neck, the way she leaned into him fully, without fear. Later, they lay in the hush of the loft, where the roof beams groaned softly above them. She traced the edge of his jaw with a fingertip, memorizing the shape of the life they were choosing. "I don't need anything finer than this," she whispered. He drew her close, his breath steady against her hair. "You'll have it anyway. Not because you need it, but because I want to give it." Outside, the creek sang low under the stars, and in the stillness between their heartbeats, the future stretched wide and possible. By midsummer, the cottonwoods along Clear Creek rustled with green fullness, and the rhythm of the days settled into something quiet but certain. Virginia woke each morning to the pale scent of sun-warmed linen and the faint creak of York rising from bed before her. She liked the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the way he stirred the coals before adding kindling. The cabin no longer held corners of unfamiliar silence. Everything inside it belonged to them now. On a Sunday when the air hung thick with heat, York returned from the west pasture with a split lip and dried blood on his collar. Virginia met him at the gate, eyes narrowing. "What happened?" "Horse caught its leg in a gopher hole," he said, pressing a handkerchief to his mouth. She bucked. "I wasn't quick enough." She touched his arm. "Did she run?" "No, she waited." Virginia led him inside, sat him on the bench near the door, and brought a clean rag. She dipped it in cool water from the crock and began wiping the cut gently. "You need to stop doing everything alone." His voice was muffled. "It's faster. It's not better." He let her finish cleaning him without arguing, though she saw the flicker of discomfort as she pressed near the bruising. When she stepped back, he caught her wrist. "I'm not used to being looked after. You are now." He nodded, like something solid had just settled in his chest. Later that week, a letter arrived by way of a traveling preacher. Virginia read it by candlelight, her fingers trembling slightly. York watched her from the stove, brow drawn tight. "Bad news." "No, just unfinished things." She folded the letter once, then again, and set it aside. "My younger cousin, the one I helped raise after her mother passed, she's working at a boarding house near Denver now. She says she's safe, and that's more than I hoped for." She asked if I ever settled anywhere. York leaned his hip against the counter. "What'll you tell her?" "That I have." That night they walked the edge of the creek, their hands linked between them. The moon hung low, almost full, and the frogs had started up their summer chorus. Virginia let her thumb brush over the back of his hand. "How long did you think you'd live alone out here?" she asked. "I stopped thinking about it. But you were waiting. For something." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth softening. "Maybe I was just waiting for you." The next morning broke warm and clear. Virginia set a basin of fresh water on the porch and knelt to scrub dust from the window glass. York stepped out behind her, holding something wrapped in oilcloth. "I've been working on this," he said, laying it on the bench. She opened it carefully, revealing a carved wooden box, small, smoothed with beeswax, the lid inlaid with a pattern of wild rye and wheat stalks. Inside sat a brass ring, simple but carefully made, the metal etched with the outline of a sprig of mint. "I didn't want to wait any longer," he said. She turned to face him, blinking against the sun. "You're asking me?" "I am." "Will you stay for good?" Virginia reached for his hand and slid the ring onto her finger. "I already have." They were married 3 weeks later in the clearing behind the barn, with the preacher who'd brought the letter standing under the cottonwoods. The widow from the ridge came, her son trying hard not to fidget. A rancher's wife brought bread. No one dressed fancy, but there were flowers, wild yarrow and lupine, that Virginia gathered herself. When York kissed her, it was quiet and steady, just like every promise he'd made since the day she arrived. They built a new shed before the first frost and filled it with stacked firewood and tools. Virginia kept teaching the neighbor children on Saturdays, using worn slates and a single primer borrowed from the preacher's satchel. York added a second bed frame in the loft, just in case her cousin ever came to visit. At night, they lay under quilts sewn from old shirts and feed sacks, listening to the wind move through the trees. In the spring that followed, Virginia stood barefoot in the garden, watching new green push up through the thawed soil. York came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into him. "We're going to need more space," she said, one hand resting lightly over her stomach. He stilled, then turned her gently to face him. "Are you sure?" She nodded, smiling. "I am." He pressed his forehead to hers, his voice rough in the soft air. "I'll build whatever you need." That year, the cabin grew by one room and one cradle. The days stretched longer, and the nights grew full of hushed lullabies and the scent of pine, pitch, and milk. Virginia planted more mint by the porch. York added a second chair beside the fire. Their life was not grand, but it was whole, solid, honest. And every morning, when Virginia woke to the sound of York's voice, low and patient as he rocked their child, she knew she had found what she never dared hope for: a place where love was lived, not spoken. A home built not from escape, but from choosing to stay, together always.